Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is Michael, and I got a really great show tonight. But before I get started, since we're going to be talking about psychopaths, I would encourage people to visit my website at michaelcross.net, where that's a big topic of discussion. So anyway, tonight we are privileged to have a guest, Professor Scott Lilienfeld. And you're from Emory, correct?
That's correct. Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay, all right. See a lot of Atlanta, Georgia when I tune into The Walking Dead.
Yes, that's where we're based, exactly.
Okay, well, as long as there's no zombies out there.
Oh, last I checked, I haven't seen any in the streets. I think we're fine.
Great. Hey, I was reading some articles a while back, and I came across some interesting stuff that you had written, or had been written about you, in reference to, of all things, psychopathic heroism. And, well, can you just kind of tell the viewers, I mean, most of them probably think that a hero is the antithesis of a psychopath. And, well, is that true, or is it something that maybe is a little bit more complex?
Well, we're actually not sure ourselves, to be honest, and I think I'm a bit of two minds about this. So you're right, we've done some work on it. I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but it stems from some speculations, actually, from my late PhD advisor at the University of Minnesota, a man by the name of David Lykken, Lykken, and David speculated, really more based on clinical conjecture than any data, that there is some kind of link between psychopathy and heroism. He actually said in his typical literary way that the psychopath and the hero are twigs off the same branch. And his reasoning there is that he viewed the core trait in psychopathy to be fearlessness, sort of a lack of fear, which often gets them in trouble. So we're accustomed to people not having enough fear doing bad things, which they often do. They may end up robbing banks and hurting people and taking unnecessary risks and driving drunk and things like that. But he argued that there's a flip side of that coin whereby a lack of fear may in some cases also give rise to certain kinds of pro-social behaviors, such as heroic behaviors, that may be facilitated by a lack of fear. So that's kind of what got us interested in that issue. I think some of it depends on how you define heroism. We can maybe get into that, but we wanted to look at the possibility that in some cases people with at least some psychopathic traits, particularly the traits relevant to fearlessness, might actually predispose people toward engaging in behaviors that society at least would regard as heroic.
Okay. In fiction, we have characters such as Superman or James Bond. Do they show what you call the fearless dominance?
Yeah, so Bond certainly does. Superman in some ways does too. I guess depends on whether he's Superman or Clark Kent, I suppose, right? But James Bond certainly showed that constellation of traits that we call. Actually, my colleague and friend Chris Patrick at Florida State University coined that term, along with Stephen Benning, fearless dominance, which we see as a constellation of traits very relevant to psychopathy, psychopathic personality. So people high in fearless dominance, as you can probably tell by the name, are often physically fearless. They often seek adventure. They're often risk-taking. They often are socially dominant, as you can tell by the name. They're often socially potent. They make a very good first impression. They're often strong leaders. And also they tend to be relatively immune to stress and anxiety. They tend to be quite resilient in the face of stress. But not everyone agrees with us on this. But according to our model, those are traits that often can lead people to get into trouble in some cases. And there's some data that's showing that they may be linked to certain kinds of problematic behaviors like fraud and maybe some kinds of crimes. And they're often also related to high racial behaviors in some cases. But we also think that those behaviors can lead to, or at least be associated with, certain positive outcomes, as we see in James Bond.
Well, one of the traits that, like Harris' psychopathy checklist, is based. Well, you already talked about wanting kind of an adventure, they tend to get bored, but also the aspect of not really wanting to follow social convention. In other words, I guess they're like nonconformist. You'd say that's correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's probably true that people with psychopathy tend to be somewhat nonconformist. We actually have a scale on our test. We have a self-report measure of psychopathy, and one of the scales on it we actually call rebellious nonconformity. And they often flaunt social conventions, flout social conventions, and don't care much about what people think about them, and are very happy to do things that are anti-authoritarian. Some of that may be because they're angry and are alienated from society. It may also be because they don't really care much about what people think about them, and are quite happy to do as they please, and are not worried about social disapproval.
So maybe that could explain situations. I mean, we always find these horrible stories about someone getting mugged in the street and just people standing around until someone rushes out to the aid of the person. And I guess that would be someone who doesn't care about just kind of blending in and not jumping out and doing something. So maybe that being a psychopath could have a plus there.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's some older data way back when. I haven't seen it replicated, reproduced recently, although I'm not sure anyone's looked at it, but I believe looking at predictors of helping in emergency situations. And if I recall correctly, there were a couple of studies suggesting that people who are nonconformist are often more likely to help in those situations, partly because they aren't as concerned about making a fool of themselves or doing what other people expect them to do. So you're right that in a lot of these situations, what you see, and there's classic work on this going back to the work of two psychologists, Darley and Latney, here in the U.S. back in the 60s and 70s, what you often see in these situations is that a lot of people stand around and don't do anything when there's an emergency. And there are a couple of reasons for that, but one reason is that people often, one reason certainly is that people are scared, and they're afraid of taking risks. Another reason is that people often are putting responsibility on other people. They don't feel as much personal responsibility to do anything. And it may also be true that social norms, expectations play a role in intervening. So if no one is doing something, you may feel inhibited because you might feel stupid or foolish to break through that veil of conformity.
So that seems like it might be even a trait that would go into leadership. I mean, a lot of times people don't like to speak in front of people. They certainly don't want to take a risk of being under scrutiny if they, I don't know, run for political office or something. It seems like that could actually be one of the reasons why there's a lot of speculation that psychopathy tends to be higher in politics then.
Yeah, that's right. That's one speculation. I don't think there are a lot of data showing that's true. So one thing you'll quickly discover if you start reading the literature on psychopathic personality is that there's a lot of clinical lore and a lot of speculation, but not a lot of data. And it may be true. I think it's tricky because it could very well be that there's an optimal dose of some of these traits. So you might, for a good leader, you might want to be somewhat fearless, and certainly you want to be dominant. It's very hard to get elected president of the U.S., certainly, if you're not a dominant person and someone who is fairly socially fearless and willing to take on controversial issues. On the other hand, it could be that if it's too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And it could be that if those traits become too extreme, that will result in negative behaviors because fearlessness may very quickly merge into recklessness and carelessness when it gets too high.
So if you go by scale, the 0 to 40 points that person can get on the hair checklist, someone that's a 40 might take too many risks, whereas someone who's maybe a 20 to 25 or 30 might have the brakes to not go and do something dumb then.
Yeah, it's possible. The one thing I'd say is that it probably is not a single scale, the psychopathy checklist, because it looks like what we call psychopathy is very multidimensional. There are many dimensions underlying it. So with the PCLR, the psychopathy checklist revised, which some listeners might know, if they don't, I can explain it. It's sort of the most widely used measure of psychopathy in prison and other forensic settings. It looks like it's actually measuring several different things. So it's a little hard to know, but I think your instincts, I think, are right. There may be some truth to what you're saying. And I think I would say is if there's a measure, say, of fearlessness or low anxiety, you might see the kind of pattern you're describing. Now, we've looked at that in some of our data. We occasionally find hints of that tendency, where if it gets too extreme, bad things happen, but I would not say it's entirely consistent. But I think there's some maybe better research designs one could use to look at that.
Okay. Yeah, so essentially, if you're taking a look at the term impulsive aggressiveness and so forth, essentially that's just kind of a scientific term for boldness, isn't it?
Well, it turns out actually it's a bit different. So there's a separate dimension that comes out of some psychopathy measures. Impulsive antisociality, we call it self-centered impulsivity, but I think it's a fairly similar trait. So oddly enough, it is largely independent of boldness, at least in our data. Maybe a little bit correlated, so it may be a very slight positive correlation, but it looks as though they're two somewhat different systems. And according to some models, what we call psychopathy may be a confluence of both of those dimensions. That is, to be a sort of classical, prototypical psychopath, you might need to be someone who's very disinhibited, which is more of that impulsive antisocial dimension you're referring to. You might be someone who has very poor impulse control. You might be someone who is reckless. You might be someone who doesn't think much before they do things. People with those traits also sometimes tend to be callous and unempathic. And, again, to be more of a classical psychopath, you might also need to be high in that fearless dominance component as well. You might be someone who's charming and dominant and fearless. So it may be those two sets of traits in conjunction that comprises psychopathy, although that's still a controversial issue.
Okay, speaking of controversial issues, would you say that this is something that is entirely genetic, a combination of genes and environment for expression? What causes psychopathy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one thing I would say is everything that psychologists have looked at in the personality realm, including psychopathy, is certainly a mixture of nature and nurture. So we know from twin studies that there is definitely a heritable component. Whether or not it is a heritable component to psychopathy itself, which I'm inclined to doubt, as opposed to personality traits that are themselves related to psychopathy, is a separate question. I think probably what we're seeing is it's unlikely there's a genetic component to psychopathy per se, but there are certainly genetic influences on the traits that go along with psychopathy, like lack of fear and poor impulse control and being callous and so on. But there's also a big environmental component. But getting to your question, we don't know what it is. That problem is in most of these studies, not to get too technical, but in most of these studies, the environment is more or less defined by exclusion. That is, we can look at twin studies and say, yeah, there's a heritable element to these traits, and then the environment is whatever's left over. But we do not know what those environmental influences are. So some people have speculated, for example, that parenting practices may play some role in psychopathy. I suspect they do, and it could very well be that having if you're a fearless child, and other people, including my PhD mentor David Lichten, have argued this. If you're a very, very fearless child, and you have a parent who isn't very good, you may end up becoming a criminal later. Whereas if you're a fearless child, but you have a parent who instills in you a sense of pride and it's a good role model and teaches you how to channel those traits into something constructive, you might end up being a politician instead of a criminal. Of course, you could be both. But in parenting, some of those traits are channeled. Now, I'm not sure that parenting plays as much a role in changing the traits themselves, but they may play a big role in what avenues individuals with those traits go down.
Ah, that's very interesting indeed. Now, one other thing I want to address here is in your research. Some people believe, for instance, and you'll see this on social media and stuff whenever the topic psychopaths come up, that psychopaths have no empathy whatsoever, whereas I've heard also the theory that they're just very good at repressing it and letting it come out whenever they want to. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it's a complex question. I'd answer it in a couple of ways. So number one, I think virtually nothing in psychology is all or none. So I don't think I think someone who claims that psychopathic individuals have no empathy, I think it's going beyond the data, and I think it's very unlikely because there probably are some people with very, very extreme psychopathic traits who have no empathy, but almost always in psychology, and this is no exception, we're talking about gradation. So what we typically in psychopathy we see in these individuals is that there's a diminution in empathy, and there's less than one sees in other people. It's also, though, important to understand that empathy itself is not one thing. So there's a good deal of psychological literature suggesting that there's a big difference between cognitive empathy, thinking empathy, which is more the ability to put yourself in the shoes of another person, and more affective empathy, which is sometimes called sympathy, which is the ability to feel the states of another person. You might think those go together closely, but oftentimes they do not. They're actually two quite different traits. So most evidence suggests, although even here it's mixed, and the psychopathy field is often confusing in this way, but I would say the bulk of the evidence, with some exceptions, suggests that psychopathic individuals are probably fairly intact in cognitive empathy. They're often good at putting themselves in the shoes of another person, or maybe as good as you and I would be. But they are deficient in affective empathy. That is, they don't feel the feeling states of other people. But again, even there, I think it's likely that we're talking about a continuum or dimension rather than an all or none phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, a psychopathic individual could be a very caring husband and father, or wife and mother, but it would only be for a very small circle of people. Maybe out in the regular world, they're kind of like a lion.
Well, I think that's right. I think that some people, I think Peter Singer's talked about this in terms of all of our circles of empathy differ, and they differ undoubtedly over time. We all have circles of empathy to which our empathy extends. And I suspect that you're right, that in psychopathic individuals, they may, in some cases, have empathy, but their circle may be much more limited. It may extend to people in their family or close friends, but it may not extend much far beyond that. So many of us, when we're watching a news story on television, we may get indignant or upset when we see people starving, people who are displaced by a natural disaster or war. That may make us feel terrible and make us feel indignant and feel bad about people who are suffering, who we don't know. With psychopathy, you may be less likely to see that because their circle of empathy may be much more limited to people they know well, and then perhaps more cynically in some cases, people who can benefit them directly.
Just for fun, have you ever considered which presidents in history might be the ones that show high levels of psychopathy, but also the positive trait too of heroism and fearless dominance?
Well, we have a bit of data on that. So we published a study in our lab, which is not perfect, but it got a bit of attention. It was a study in which expert historians who knew each president well, most of these were expert biographers on each president, rated each U.S. president on a number of personality traits using some detailed questionnaires. And from those questionnaires, we were able to extract pretty good estimates of those traits I was talking about earlier, fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality, which we now call self-centered impulsivity. So we have some data on that. I wouldn't say it's conclusive, but there were some presidents who did get quite high scores. So that for, I don't know how much Swedish listeners know about U.S. presidents, but presidents who scored among the highest were LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. LBJ was one of the highest scorers. Andrew Jackson was a very, very high scorer. And what they were high in both fearless dominance and impulsive antisociality. So they were high in both of those dimensions. An interesting counterpoint to that was Theodore Roosevelt, who was very high in fearless dominance, but not elevated in the other aspects of psychopathy. So at least according to our model, he would not be regarded as a classic psychopath. So he was very dominant. He would suck the air out of a room. He was a very powerful person socially, very influential, but he was also very conscientious and was a person with good impulse control who treated, by and large, other people well. So in some ways, maybe that's kind of the ideal mix for a politician, someone who has those traits, just a moderate dose of those traits, but also has good impulse control and knows how to temper those traits appropriately. In the U.S. right now, we're just beginning to get started with our presidential elections, and there are lots of people running on both sides, and that's, I think, something for people to look for. There's a lot of controversy in the U.S., and I'm sure there is in Europe too, about whether personality should matter in selecting a president. I'm inclined to think it should matter a bit. I'm not sure it should be the overriding factor. I think sometimes in the U.S. it matters too much. I think we focus too much on personalities, but I think it should matter a bit. And I think one thing we need to look for is someone maybe who is does have some gumption and some oomph and some ability to go against the grain when necessary. Fearless dominance may be one, not the only, but maybe one way of accomplishing that. So you want someone who can be dominant and who can be strong, but also you need someone who shows good judgment, and that's really where the other dimension comes in. Someone who can inhibit their impulses, because I'm sure when you're president, I'm sure feel like slamming down the phone a lot when you're talking to people both inside and outside of your country. So you need someone who knows when to modulate those traits appropriately.
And one who's read Machiavelli a lot.
That probably helps a little bit too. That's right.
Hey, one last question. I know your schedule's pretty tight here, but one last question. I know that narcissism is something that overlaps into psychopathy, but some people show more psychopathy, some people show more narcissism. If you were electing, if you were able to see the person, do a personality evaluation on candidates that are running for office, don't need to mention any right now in the United States, and you had one that tended to score a little higher on psychopathy, but another one that scored a little higher on narcissism, which one would you want to choose?
Well, yeah, that's a hard question. Of course, we have no narcissism among U.S. politicians. We've never seen that before. So it's hard to say because, again, I think I see so I'll answer it in a somewhat indirect way, partly because I think what we're talking about with both psychopathy and narcissism are nations of different traits. I don't see them as, and again, some people disagree with us on that, but I and my colleagues typically don't see them as one trait. I think they're different blends of traits. So what I would say is if I were looking for someone, I think I would look for someone who is not necessarily narcissistic, but someone who has certainly high self-esteem and is someone who is able and willing to take appropriate risks and is socially self-confident, but also can temper those traits appropriately. So I think there are different little bits and pieces of psychopathy and narcissism in there. But I think what you see in psychopathy and narcissism classically is that those traits are taken to a great extreme. Now, narcissism itself, I should also point out, not to make it even more complicated, narcissism itself is pretty multidimensional too. It looks like there's a kind of grandiose dimension underlying a lot of narcissism. So there's some narcissistic traits that are characterized by being very braggadocious and flamboyant and so on. And other traits that are more marked by being vulnerable and touchy and having a thin skin. And what we found in a separate study, again, it's only the U.S. presidents and how much it generalizes beyond the U.S. And also beyond presidents we don't know. But we did find is that the grandiose blend of narcissism, again, the type of narcissism that's more characterized by being kind of braggadocious and flamboyant and extremely extroverted is a bit of a double-edged sword. So it's related to both some good leadership abilities. It's good at being perceived as a strong leader, but it's also related to a somewhat increased risk for certain unethical behaviors. So what I would say is if we're electing someone who's extremely narcissistic, we better watch out, because that person may be at somewhat higher risk for doing some bad things, even though they may be perceived as a strong leader. So that may be a risk that maybe we're taking in some cases, but it's one would have to think deeply about. I should also point out that vulnerable narcissism was not related to much good at all. So we weren't able to find much that was related positively. That was a good leadership trait that was associated with vulnerable narcissism. So if someone's extremely touchy, thin-skinned, that may be a set of traits one wants to look for, at least in the president.
Okay. Excellent. Hey, do you have a website listeners can visit?
Well, no, I don't really. I do have a departmental website, but I don't have any fancy websites. But if they Google me, they can certainly see a lot of my writing on psychopathy. If you just Google my name and psychopathy, a lot of stuff will pop up in both the popular and academic literature.
Excellent. I'm sure that'd be very interesting for people to study here. Okay, well, we're out of time here. So thank you, Scott, for sharing these.
My pleasure.
Hello.